Welcome, everybody. My name is Wendy Schiller. I am the interim director of the Watson Institute for International and Public Affairs. I'm also the director of the Taubman Center and the Allison S. Ressler Professor of Political Science. We are really excited today to have Olivia Beavers, who's a Congressional Reporter for Politico, and I'll read a proper introduction for her. And the impetus, there's also some seats down in front if you want to come down in front, I know. Like my students don't always want, you can always leave when you need to. I will say that the impetus for this invitation stems from the fact that I was in Washington in May at a conference sponsored by another Ivy League university that we won't mention from New Jersey. They had an evening panel, and Olivia Beavers, there's a seat over there if you want in the middle, and Olivia Beavers was on the panel, and I was so taken with her analysis that I went up to her afterwards and said, I want to bring you to Brown. So I'm really excited that you made time in an extremely busy time of year for you to come to Brown. So, Olivia Beavers is a congressional reporter for Politico, focusing on House Republicans and GOP leadership. Olivia first joined the Congress team on January 3rd, 2021, as author of the Huddle newsletter. Just 3 days in, Olivia was the first to author an inside-the-room perspective hours after being trapped in the House chamber during the January 6th Capitol attack. Prior to joining Politico, Olivia Beavers regularly broke news covering House-led investigations for the Hill, including scoops during the first impeachment of then President Donald Trump, where she served as the outlet's lead impeachment reporter. Olivia also has written extensively about former special counsel Robert Mueller's probe and the parallel congressional Russia investigations. A Virginia native and a University of Virginia graduate, Olivia got her start in Washington in 2016 as a news associate at CNN, where she ran scripts and survived teleprompting. It's got to be typo on my part.
That's correct.
That's right. Survived teleprompting for various shows during the hectic presidential election. She started at The Hill. The Hill is a longtime Washington, D.C. and Capitol Hill newspaper as a breaking news reporter before covering cybersecurity and the national security. In her free time, Olivia is a horse lover, amateur card shark, and bookworm. Interesting combination. So a warm welcome for Olivia Beavers. I will say, and you're going to speak for a little while, and then we're going to do some questions. I will say that there's a combination of people in the room. There could be some aspiring reporters. There could be some actual reporters at the moment, and everybody who's interested in politics. So welcome, Olivia Beavers.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for coming. This is really exciting because I usually would not have even been admitted to a school like Brown. So it's an honor to be speaking here. I started covering Congress in late 2017, 2018, and it was right as the Trump effect was happening. The committee that I focused on was the House Intelligence Committee, which had been previously very bipartisan in how they worked together. Intelligence, as they argued, was supposed to be above partisan politics. It's the country's national security. And at that point, the Russia investigation had started to get underway. And I remember coming in and trying to get a baseline of what was normal since I was new to the Hill. And I remembered asking Adam Schiff and saying, is this normal? And he goes, none of this is normal. And then I asked Devin Nunes, what is normal? And he goes, none of this is normal. And that's how I got my start in Congress. Since then, I have lived through 3 presidential impeachment inquiries in the House. I have lived through COVID and covering the Capitol during that sort of weird time period. I lived through the January 6th insurrection. We believed that the Capitol chamber, the House chamber, was the safe room, and it was designed to be where you would seek refuge if there was an attack, but we weren't prepared for a mob attack. We were prepared for a lone terrorist sort of attack. So there were way too many doors. I was on the front lines of covering Kevin McCarthy's ouster and the expulsion of George Santos, who I also survived him trolling my dress for White House Correspondents. I wanted to quickly give just a quick background for the lay of the land. I started covering Republicans after January 6th. I have covered both parties, and it was never technically assigned, but the there was just so much need for coverage about what was happening internally while I was doing the newsletter that I just sort of became one of the two House Republican-focused reporters. That's how our newsroom has chosen to break up what we call beats. We have a Democratic leadership reporter, and we also have some who are more broad, and like House investigations nowadays, which used to be my own beat, and a few others. So a lot of what I do on the Hill is based in trust and reputation, and it takes a lot of time to understand where the push points are for certain members, who has an old grudge that's lasted 10 years, and watching those grudges play out, whether it's a member tanking another member's piece of legislation because they just don't like who that individual is, or watching how personal ambitions and a growing divide in the party has sort of dictated some of the current events. So I'm very excited to be here and looking forward to our discussion.
Thank you. I also want to make sure to thank Joseph Paolino and the Paolino family for funding this lecture series. This is the inaugural Paolino lecture. We're very excited to have their support, and we're looking forward to not only Olivia Beavers, but having future guests at Brown sponsored by the Paolino family. So thanks to them. Okay, so we are, I know we like to get all of our questions in. So I will ask a few questions, and then we will most likely open this up to audience questions by just about 5:35, so that people can get their questions in and make sure that we have it slotted till 6:30. So we are available for, afterwards if people have questions. Okay. Question number one. Because we're in a college setting, I like to begin these conversations by asking our guest speaker how their career evolved over time. Are you where you thought you would be when you started out? And how have you created your opportunities?
Well, when I first started out, I didn't have the background that came with doing reporter internships. I'd done journalism in high school, and I had basically a bad news story impact my home community. And it was a news story that ended up not being true. And I remember feeling frustrated about the coverage. And so basically the end of my college career, I decided to pursue journalism. And that took about 10 months before someone decided to give me a shot, which was CNN in 2016. And boy, did I not know what I was signing up for at the time. When you're getting your foot in the door, you are not working a 9-to-5. You do not have access to your weekends. You are a flaky friend, and you are just trying to survive on basically minimum wage as a reporter. And but it was a front seat to history, and that's how I try to look at what I do, and try to make sure I'm relaying it in the best way possible. A lot of my jobs have been fighting for them. I moved from CNN to the Hill newspaper because a fellow reporter decided to put my name forward and suggest that the editor-in-chief meet with me because they liked my reporting. And the joke is that he never had seen anything that I'd ever written. So that's a good friend. And I outed him only when I departed 3 years later. And then
Hold on. Mr. Mayor and Madam State Senator, there's a seat here and there's a seat here if you want to come to the front. Alan Fung is our former twice governor, GOP candidate for governor and mayor of Cranston, and his partner has also been a state senator and just recently a candidate is for mayor.
So, and then I went to Politico, which is where I am presently.
So does that... I want to follow up just for a second on that, is that when you think about getting a reference from people, have you learned that it can be one encounter or two encounters with people that make a good impression and that may come back to be a benefit to you? Or do you feel that you have to cultivate somebody more frequently or more deeply in Washington to get that kind of recommendation?
It's case by case. So someone who really helped me, who said she saw something in me, and I I now feel like I'm at the point in my career where I see there's an element of hunger. Ann Compton was the first White House correspondent at ABC, and I met her through a job where I was basically an executive assistant. And my boss at the time, I was at the UVA Miller Center, which is a presidential think tank, and he knew that I wanted to be in journalism. And so he kept on pulling my seat up next to every reporter that came through. And not all of them could help me, but she said, let me send some emails for you. And that's basically how I got my foot in the door. DC is very much, and so is journalism, because a lot of it is based off of sources about who you know. But I don't want that to be like a deterrent, because you can get to know people. I started with barely knowing anyone, and what you have to do is just keep getting to know people. One of the things that I have realized in journalism is that some journalists have turned their nose up to interns reaching out, or low-level staff assistants who might try to contact me and say, hey, can we get coffee? And sometimes they're like, I've been asked by interns, how do I get into journalism? And I'm like, oh, this is not how I thought this was going to go. But I've also had very low-level people send me some very good stories, and I can't explicitly say what those are because I'd be giving away. But think of one of those stories where different groups in the House start doing investigations into the leaks because no one suspected a low-level person. So it is who you know. It's just you don't have to be talking to the top leadership, although that's now important in what I cover.
Very good point. Thanks. Did you have journalistic or political summer internships in college? And do you think that they were helpful in building your career?
They were definitely helpful. I was an intern at the State Department. I realized it was in the energy resource office, and I realized I should not have been there compared to the Rice interns. But I survived reading the quest and didn't look back at covering energy again. That was not my forte. I sort of divide journalists up into two groups in my head, and the ones who are the best are the ones who are able to combine the two. But I feel like there's the policy reporters who are able to tell you how important various policies are. It can be the farm bill, it can be a transportation bill, it can be all of these. That's not my forte, and I will work with reporters who know that subject area. But I'm a political reporter. I like meeting with members throughout the week, understanding the dynamics of what's happening, understanding who people are, who is the leadership trying to recruit to run for office, who are they trying to prevent from running for office, and all of that sort of comes into a variety of, different relationships. I'm sort of to step back. So how do you think the career of political journalism has changed since the time you first started? So, for example, is there more opportunity for crossover, as you've done, from cable to newspapers to social media and back? Like, what does that landscape look like for you since you started and then going forward? So there's a lot of people who have had a similar starts that I have had, where CNN looks impressive on the resumes, and so they'll hire you up, MSNBC. But there's also a lot of sort of cross back. So CNN and MSNBC started hiring print reporters who are breaking news. Fox is a little bit still more traditional, where they hire local TV reporters. But CNN has pulled Manu Raju. They just pulled someone from Politico named Sarah Ferris, and they keep pulling talents that they know can break news because they'd rather have the news first and then train the TV element sometimes second. And so there's a lot of crossover. So I'm actually very much pro getting into print no matter what type of journalism you want to do, because that's a skill that will just transfer to many different opportunities down the line.
Isn't it interesting that you say print? Because of a certain generation, we know what that means, an actual piece of paper that has been printed on. But essentially I still get the piles of papers at home, but I'm a dinosaur in that respect. So, it seems to me, the students say to me, what sources do you use for politics to keep up? And I literally say I pretty much go to a lot of them all the time just to see what they're covering. And The Hill, to me, generationally, seems quite different from Politico. Like, Politico is sort of the upstart, and Hill's been there for a long time. Could you explain a little bit of the difference between working for The Hill and working for Politico, which was an entirely digital organization and news source, whereas The Hill, used to have an actual paper. I don't know if it still does.
They both have newspapers, actually.
Oh, Politico has
yes.
newspapers?
Yes, but unlike with The Hill, we'd have to write differently for the newspaper versus what we did digitally. I never know when my story is in the newspaper for Politico, and it's more like a Hill rag where it's passed throughout DC. But there it's more of a pleasant surprise than me being aware that it's going to be placed there. The Hill was a great place to start. You have probably the highest number of young, eager journalists being put on The Hill. And so when I'm asked for advice, my advice to aspiring journalists is to go for the places where you're going to be handed the opportunities, not for the flashy names. Flashy names look great, especially if you're doing those internships. But when you're looking to get experience on The Hill, go to The Hill, and then you can move from there. That's where I kind of got my start. It was more, I think, pretty more basic kind of journalism, but that's where I started doing my source development. I made a few mistakes, and those are a little bit less high profile. And then you move on to other sort of outlets, and I feel like Politico has really allowed me to take the next step in my career and blossom.
When you say you made a mistake without naming names, could you give us an example of the kind of mistake?
Yeah, so there was one time we were combing through financial disclosures, and I had found a name of, I think, like a former AG who had given money. And I had called the state to make sure that there was no one else by that name who lived there. And they said yes, and I could not find the actual person to contact. So I talked to my editor, and he said, if that's the only person, we'll run with it. It turns out there was some sort of error in the records, and it was one of those embarrassing, you have to like put the corrections in the headline sort of thing, which never feels good, and tell the person that you're sorry. But it's one of those where we should have worked, a little bit harder to make sure that we found the right contact for that person before we ran the story. So sometimes they can just be dumb mistakes. But I do feel like as a reporter, when we make mistakes, which we're all human, people immediately suggest that means bias, that means malintent, that means activism, when really it could just be someone making a mistake.
That's a good point to remember. So when you think about cultivating, and then I'm going to get into the political questions, one last sort of career question. How you just said something about The Hill and getting really good print reporting experience, and that's a good place to start. In 2024, going into 2025, what are the differences if you're working for Politico in reaching out for sources or for information, or The Hill, or Fox, or the Washington Beacon, or the Wall Street Journal, or the Washington Post? Like, are there some where if you say you're calling from these organizations, will you get no response? I mean, how does that really work now?
A lot of it is relationships. And so, like, I'll give you an example. I have a friend who covers House Republicans with me, and she had gone to CNN. And I remember this Freedom Caucus member telling me, I am never going to talk to CNN. He was upset with the outlet. And fast forward probably 2 months, and I see him talking to my reporter friend. And so I go, oh, I guess you don't care about talking to CNN. And he goes, wait, she's CNN? I was like, yes, she is. And he goes, oh, well, I like her. And I said, I know, she's a good one. And so that relationship carried on. And I just had another colleague who moved to a different, younger outlet to be a bureau chief. And he said he has still kept his sources. So if you have those relationships, they will move and transfer with you. From my experience, whether they like your outlet as much or not. I do have friends who have started in more liberal news outlets, and they found it was easier to make Democratic member sources, and same with the people who started at more conservative news outlets. They're more willing to kind of give you the time if you don't have those established relationships. But a lot of it is built on time and reputation. And I remember when I was pretty young on the Hill, one member had told three others, and they all ended up being powerful Republicans. But he said, I don't talk to that reporter because he's not fair. And it was some reporter on the Hill. But I like this reporter because I think they're always fair. And those members went around telling everyone. And that's how the Hill works. It's a lot about word of mouth. If you're told something off the record and then you choose to then go ahead and use it in your story, or you're not careful with them giving you information, they will tell other people. I've had the reverse where a member has gone around saying, I've given her stuff on background and she's never burned me. And that word of mouth has really helped my career.
So that was my next question.
Oh, sorry.
Is how do you make, no, don't apologize. That's great. How do you make those choices as a reporter not to alienate your source, but also to give readers an in-depth glimpse of what's going on? How do you balance that out when you're forming a story, writing a story?
A lot of it's negotiation. So sometimes you start on a phone call. It depends what the nature is. There are stories where almost every Republican will want to comment, and then there are stories where none of them will want to comment. And so you'll call them and they'll be like, this is off the record. And for those of you who don't know, that means you can't use the information. You can use it sort of to ask more educated questions, but you can't include it as a source. You can't include it in your print. And then there's background. Background can be very bare-boned, whether it's a source familiar with the matter to a senior Republican in House leadership, or, the top three, among the top three Republican leaders. It can be very narrow. And then there's on the record where they name themselves. And I'll sometimes go out to dinner with members, and when you're drinking, those conversations are off the record. But then I'll come to them the next day and I'll say, excuse me, I remember you were talking about this. Could I ask about this? And they'll sometimes say yes, and they'll sometimes say no. Sometimes a no is, well, only 2 people know about that. That would point back to me. Sometimes they say, oh yeah, 10 people know. Ask this person, and then I get a story. So in that way, I try to basically approach it by being clear where we are so that they don't feel burnt. I will come up and be like pointing my phone in a very obvious way that it is an on the record question. Or otherwise I'll be like, I get it. I know this is sensitive. Can you talk to me in a background way?
So it's always a balancing act.
It is a balancing act. And I will say one other thing about the background. I get that people are frustrated sometimes that they can't know who that person is. And I do think from some of my experience, there have been times where I've been frustrated that I've given someone the ability to go on background, because I remember doing a story and I was trying to talk to House Republicans before Donald Trump had run again. And I was asking them, do you want Donald Trump to run again? And there were a variety of answers. Some certainly did, but some were privately telling me, I don't want him to run again. We loved his policies, but he brought too much drama to us. And then one of those same members ended up being a very early endorser, where what they were doing publicly didn't match what they were doing privately or saying privately. And my story basically gave some sort of cover of them expressing their real views versus what they were doing elsewhere. And that's something that you sort of just learn after the fact versus, realizing what you're doing in the moment.
All right. So now we're going to get to some political questions.
Goody.
If you had to describe the conflict dynamics of the Republican Party in the House of Representatives, would you say they were based on ideology or political ambition of a few key players?
I would say it's a combination of both. So there's a lot of talk about how Congress started to shift once there were cameras in committee rooms. And I don't know if any of you have chosen to watch the C-SPAN footage, but there are times where it's such a high-profile hearing that the goal is not to get new answers. It is basically everyone asks the same question so they can get the same social media clip that they can post online and look viral. And so when you're a reporter covering those, you're like, oh, dear Lord, and not another one of these questions. Social media, 24-hour news, and sort of this new influencer culture has definitely taken a foot in Congress. And but there's also more of a split screen between those who are very, very conservative and those who are more centrist. And you can see it in the abortion debate, where you have some Freedom Caucus members who say they want abortion banned and they're against IVF. And then most of the party is pro IVF, but there's debate among where they should be on abortion. And so that issue has really kind of put the Republican Party on their back foot.
So let's look ahead. I'm just going to two-finger on that particular question, and actually it goes to the election going into 2024. So do you find there are differences in ideology or policy priorities among Republicans who come from purple or blue states as compared with members who come from red states?
Yes. But there's also a different incentive. So if you are coming from a purple district, whether it's a Biden district or you're just not in a particularly, R+15 district, then you're much more likely to be touting a bipartisan record and wanting to reach across the aisle. I had a Republican leadership staffer tell me that they thought Kristen Sinema, who is in the Senate now as an independent, was very smart as a House member because she made sure she learned who all of the floor leadership members were, so she could come up and say, why haven't you put my bill on the floor? It's bipartisan. And she could basically pressure the staffers of GOP leadership to put it on. And so there is some sort of ability, if you know the other side, to get bills through. And conservatives, it plays way better with their base and their voters if they are fighting Democrats left and right. Compromise is not really something that makes them look particularly good with with the grassroots elements of the party. And so you'll hear them use the words fight a lot. We're going to go fight for you, fight for conservative ideals, fight, fight, fight. So those are words that you'll sort of hear more in the Freedom Caucus sort of groups.
And those are people who come from districts that are deep red.
Deep red. But there are a few members who come from very conservative districts who are playing well with the team. There's definitely certain votes that they can't vote for. During the speakership race, those members, even if they didn't necessarily agree with Jim Jordan, had to vote for him because that would have been inviting a primary challenger and could have really upset their base. But there are certain votes that they can take to sort of move legislation forward.
When you say invite a primary challenge, are you suggesting that the outside interest groups and moneyed people who support Jim Jordan would then go recruit somebody in the district to run against that person who opposed Jim Jordan?
That's what I've been told by certain members who think that is what happened with the grassroots. The 20 to 25, depending on the vote, who voted against Jim Jordan, some of them did get challengers, and they attributed their challenge to their vote against Jim Jordan.
Yeah. So it's outside, and it's coordinated outside groups, but coordinated by people inside the House.
I don't have that reporting, but it wouldn't surprise me.
If the Republicans retain control of the House, do you think a greater share of the majority will be MAGA loyalists to Donald Trump? How will that affect the GOP's ability to cohere as a majority?
So at least there's about 15 House Republicans who have won their primaries, and they're in safe conservative districts. So they're pretty guaranteed to be coming in. And from my sort of review of the group, they do not seem super MAGA, even though they're very pro-Trump. One of the Republicans who's coming from North Carolina, who's expected to join the Freedom Caucus, said he'll support Mike Johnson and he wants to work well with the team. But I have also watched when members come in and they start talking with the Freedom Caucus, that's when you start getting a different sort of, they have a different idea of what they want to do. So Eli Crane from Arizona, he's someone that Kevin McCarthy had campaigned with and had helped get elected. He's also someone who then opposed him to the shock and awe of the McCarthy teams from becoming Speaker in January, and ultimately voted to oust him last fall.
Sounds Shakespearean. If the GOP keeps the House, and this is a follow-up question, do you think they will reelect Speaker Mike Johnson in January, or even make that decision, formally reelect Mike Johnson in January? Why or why not? And who else might you think would challenge him?
So there's three sort of factors with Mike Johnson's, pursuit to maybe getting the gavel for a full term. One is, do they win the majority again? And if they do, what does the majority look like? Because there have been some who have said they want to vote for him. And I imagine three of the conservatives who led the charge to oust him would be among those. And also, what does Donald Trump do? So Mike Johnson does believe that Donald Trump would support him. But if Trump happens to win and he says, you know what, you've been great, but I want someone else, there is going to be a much bigger group of Republicans who don't back him and say, well, Trump should have who he wants as the speaker. So those are some of the scenarios. If they're in the minority, then it's a very different ballgame. Well, Speaker Pelosi was able to survive and stay on as minority leader. Republicans traditionally have not really followed that pattern. And a lot of them privately say that even if Mike Johnson pursued being GOP leader, they don't think he would survive. So that leads us to basically two names that we know about: Steve Scalise, who's the number 2, who has wanted the job, and Jim Jordan, who also ran for the job. And they have had a very bitter clash since the speakership race last fall.
And Steve Scalise, as you know, was one of the Congress people who was shot at the softball game and recovered from that, and then just his finished treatment for a form of cancer. So he's back and he's running. And so that would be, but he was considered part of the establishment, Steve Scalise. No, he used to be sort of the barometer for how far right you could go. And he was the majority leader to Kevin McCarthy, was he not?
Yes, he was. And so he stayed on as majority leader under Mike Johnson. Kevin McCarthy and Steve Scalise did not really have a great relationship. But the Johnson and Scalise team swear that this is sort of a different situation. But you're in a building where there is some raw political ambition. And one of my kind of favorite things is you'll hear in leadership races and House and Senate races that they were just so encouraged to run that they felt they needed to throw their name in. And it's like, well, was your spouse the first one encouraging you? Was that you talking to yourself in the mirror? Because those are usually the first people who are pushing themselves to run for those types of positions. Or you see people who might have had one or two colleagues say that because they're trying to boost you up, being like, Wendy, you should run. You should run for speaker. And during the speakership race, there were some people who I think were shocked to learn how little support they had. Although they probably could have asked a few more people and figured that out when they put their names in the hat.
So to follow up here, your expectation if the House wins the majority, pretty much with a little bit of the same majority, a kind of a slim majority, let's say between 6 and 9 seats, let's say they hold the majority, that there will continue to be significant internal divisions, that there'll be competition for power.
If they win the majority, it's more likely that it stays the same. If they lose power, then there's Steve Scalise is seen as having much more of an opportunity next to Jim Jordan. That doesn't mean that someone doesn't challenge Mike Johnson, but it means that he basically has brought the team to victory. He's been traveling and campaign and fundraising. He's been campaigning and fundraising across the country, particularly in August and October. And so it's hard to deny giving someone the gavel when they brought the team to victory, though it's still possible because that's how the House GOP is right now.
Okay. We understand you need to maintain your relationships. So if Kamala Harris wins certification of 270 electoral college votes or more at the state level, do you think, and I want to talk about this process because I just, thanks to Mike Zamora used to work for Senator Jeff Merkley, explained this to me again today. And Malcolm, I was a little bit wrong. I like that I was a little bit wrong. Do you think the newly elected House of Representatives will certify her election if the Republicans are in the majority? And is there any discussion in Washington about what happens if they fail to certify her election?
So there are two sort of new factors that will mean January 6th is probably not going to look like it did in 2021. One is security is ready. They're not going to be caught off guard. And we're expecting the Capitol to be very intensely covered with Capitol Police and local police and other folks. But in 2022, Congress passed the Electoral Reform Count Act, and that changed the level of requirement for who in the House and who in the Senate can challenge certifying election. Previously, it was one House member and then one Senate member. And for a while, the House was sort of searching for Senate partners to work with them to challenge the election, if I remember that time correctly.
Yeah.
And so
Josh Hawley.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so now it's going to require 1/5. So that would be 20 senators and 85, 87 House members, which if that was the standard then, they wouldn't have had enough to challenge the certification. It is going to be more of a traditional, process. I'm blanking on the word.
Right.
More
So
ceremonious.
It's ceremonial. So I had thought that they had to affirmatively accept the delegate count. I'm embarrassed to admit that I wasn't quite sure. And in fact, it's the opposite. They actually have to have a majority of each chamber reject the electoral college count, right, for it to be not certified. And if both houses don't reject it, and they need a majority to do that. So if they get 87 people in the House to challenge it in the first place, but even if the House fails to, they still need a majority of people to reject the certification.
They need 87 in the House and 20 in the Senate.
Just to make the objection.
Just to challenge the certification.
Just to challenge. If they get that, though, although it's unlikely to get that in the Senate,
then there will be a lot of lawyers involved.
There'll be a what?
A lot of lawyers involved.
But then they would have to actually then vote against certification.
Yes.
You can have an objection and a debate, but then you need a majority of each chamber to vote against accepting this, and you need both of them to vote against to deny a victory to Kamala Harris.
I believe so, yes.
All right. So if you think about the messaging, and this is what I want my follow up on this. If you think about the messaging to the American people, I like to think I know what's going on, and I couldn't quite get this right. Imagine people who either support Trump or support Harris and then think, okay, they're stealing it. They're not doing it right. I don't understand the process. And so in that sense, when will we learn about this process? Will there be people writing articles about, will you be writing? Who will be writing these articles?
It probably won't be me, but there will be people who, explainers are very common. So we have on our team sort of an institutionalist reporter who would have the context of talking to the various sort of people who can tell you step by step what that day is going to look like. And so she would be someone on our team who would write probably post-election what that's going to look like.
I want to follow up again. So if you are a Republican and you are either newly elected or you've only been elected, for one term, and you're looking at 2026, where we expect midterm elections to be held no matter what, and you're thinking about a primary challenge, why wouldn't you vote to challenge certification? You need 87, but 150 really voted last time. So why not vote that way? Because then you're not vulnerable to a primary challenge on that question.
I think that's a fair question. And one of the sort of digging that I tried to do was asking Republicans or asking themselves or about their friends whether they regretted not voting to certify. And the answers that you get probably more privately was that some felt like they couldn't that they would lose their reelection. And what ended up providing cover for them was the eventual impeachment after January 6th, and the 10 Republicans, including Liz Cheney, who voted against them. So that was seen as giving cover for those Republicans who ultimately voted to certify. But at the time, Republicans, many of them, viewed that vote as something that could impact, if not kill, their House careers. So there definitely is, it's a fair question to ask what that pressure looks like. There has only been one member who has told me in a way that was reportable that he regretted his vote not to certify, but his answer was not. He'll still argue that he had concerns about how the election went in terms of fraud. He says he regrets siding with Trump because he hated how Mike Pence was treated on January 6th. So that was his reasoning. I don't have a crystal ball, but I do imagine that in politics, there's always a calculation about surviving.
So in some ways, maybe it was a mistake for the Democrats to impeach Donald Trump because it gave Republicans the opportunity to get that kind of cover.
You could say
strategically,
that.
if you're a Democrat in the House. So let's switch gears a little bit. I have two more questions and we'll open it up. Do you believe that you have faced challenges or obstacles in achieving career success because you are a woman? If so, could you describe them?
The short answer is yes. And the Hill is no different, I feel like, from different workplaces, except if a member or House staffer is being creepy, there's no HR. It's not like they're internal to my company. I will say, though, I found that the majority of my sort of contacts are respectful. But as women, we still have to dance around optics. And that's the same for House conservative women who I've talked to about this. They find that they have to be mindful and sort of do group dinners just to make sure that there's not an unfair rumor. I will do source meetings with another female reporter to sort of have an extra buffer. And so there's sort of that play. Another element that I do want to highlight is, like, there's these tropes about women in the workplace. And I found as a female reporter, women who have helped me propel in this career. It has been women who have fostered and mentored, and I've found that they have been extremely supportive. And I'm working on a story, so it's not out yet, but I've talked to House conservative women, and I interviewed 24 out of the 34, and they say that that's their same experience in the House, is that they are more in the line of pulling a chair up for other women versus saying there's only room for one. And I think that there's a sort of a certain environment and intensity about the Capitol where you're like, yes, we want more of you here. So strength in numbers.
All right, that sounds reasonable. What advice do you have for students who want to pursue a career in journalism or political journalism specifically as they now go through college? You've given us a little bit of advice. What if you are a Republican-leaning student right now and you are looking for journalistic opportunities, and you may or may not be a Donald Trump Republican, but you're Republican and you want to work for Republicans? Is there any guidance there, sort of how to do that, or which publications maybe to work for, which would give you flexibility and which not?
Well, so you can be a reporter and have political views, but it just matters if you can put those views aside. So if you are a conservative and you're for Trump, then you can still work for any news outlet as long as you are not letting your personal views impact your work. And the same for being for Harris and being liberal and not letting that bias seep into your work. There are definitely sort of certain conservative outlets. So you could work for the Daily Caller, the Washington Examiner, and then there's more liberal like The Nation and The Guardian, and various TV shows too, on Fox and MSNBC and late night, sort of more talk show versus the earlier straight news shows. And so there's definitely places for people of all political views, but there's also very much a place for people who don't let their views be shown in their work. And I think that those reporters are really important.
All right, that's really interesting. So we're going to open it up to audience questions. 'Cause I could go on all night, and I don't want to do that. And we are. Should we how do we do the microphones? Do we have enough?
We
Or?
have one and then two.
Okay, great. So I have a question right here,
Be nice, everyone.
and then we'll go back and forth.
Thank you. Hi, my name's Chris, and I'm a sophomore here.
Hi,
My
Chris.
question's just, this might be a bit difficult to answer, but when people share their like info off the record with you, do you perceive it as like more often they're trying to undermine someone else, or more often that they're trying to like advance their own interests?
It can be a series of both, but one of the common misconceptions that I have, and this happens a lot, so like every week there's Democrats meet behind closed doors and Republicans meet behind closed doors. And you're texting members in the room and you're trying to get information about what they're saying is their plan. Sometimes it's very boring and no one cares, or sometimes they're picking who's going to be their next leader. And I'll come out, members will start coming out and they go, I know who your source is because they're motivated to leak this. And that's actually really not what is the majority of the leaks. And are some of them motivated? Sure. And do we take motivated leaks as long as it's true? Sure. But there are people that you have just formed relationships with, and you kind of go to them and say, hey, this news is going to leak. Might as well leak it to me. And that's how you sort of get the information. Another thing that they do is the members will first blame staff. And they'll be like, I bet the staff is leaking this to you. And then they get rid of the staff. And then the leaks continue. So then they start pointing the fingers at each other. There are stories where sometimes it's unfavorable to two sides, and those two sides will point the finger and be like, you leaked this. And I can never confirm or deny, but sometimes it's just not even the two of them.
That's interesting. I'm going to go with, Marcus.
Hey.
First off, thank you so much. So I also have a ton of questions. So I'm going to try to combine two of mine into one and see if it works out. So earlier in the presentation, you talked about one of your friends who's a CNN person out on the Hill that was able to talk Republican thing. And so when you're coming up, I feel like that's when trust in the media was all like on a significant decline. Attacks towards the media also increased. And so how have you felt building the relationships with the people that you're reporting on has felt, and particularly compared, I guess, to like your Democrat counterpart? Like, has it been more difficult, or perhaps like being a new face, has that helped out? Yeah. And then the second question, a little bit more broader, is on the notion of like political trust or trust in the media and its decline. Is that a conversation happening in the newsroom? Like, are you all thinking about that and how to help increase that in general?
Yeah, thank you for that question. So I think like actually during Newt Gingrich's bid for president, that's when he started going after the news, and it was a very popular talking point. And so there's been a more of a continuation within the Republican Party. I have not found most Republicans are willing to talk. So I feel like the sort of public, fake news is very different from the actual like reality of being a Republican focused reporter. Republicans versus Democrats are also different. Republicans are much more willing to eat their own and publicly bash one another. Whatever Reagan rule it was about bashing another Republican has long disappeared. I've had headlines where you're reporting about Marjorie Taylor Greene calling Lauren Boebert a little bee and asking Marjorie Taylor Greene if that's correct. And she goes, it was surprisingly accurate. So those days are different. Democrats are much more cohesive, and they leak. I feel like sometimes there's less leaks, and Republicans complain about that. But sometimes I also feel like they can be even more vicious when they are, redistricted into a primary challenge together, and then like the gloves come off. But covering Republicans is sort of different in nature, and I find that they are largely accessible when I go up to ask them a question. Thanks.
And what about the second question about decline in the newsroom? Do you talk about decline in trust in the media?
I think that adds a stronger pressure for reporters to get it right. And it's embarrassing as a reporter to get it wrong. There's also elements of Democrats now being more trying to I think, attack reporting than there were previously. In one scenario, when I was at the Hill, one of my colleagues was reporting a story, and he had asked a progressive member of the squad a question, and instead of answering, they shook their head. And so when he went to write the story, they said no. And technically they didn't say it. And so then they tweeted over it, calling it basically a false report, which to me was a little bit unfair, even though they had shook their head. The reporter should have just written it that way. But those are sort of some of the nuances that you have to play. But there's a lot of pressure to make sure you get it right. And I came from a bad news story, so I try to always invite members to say, hey, even if the quotes are right, even if the information reads right, but you still feel like something was missed, please approach me and tell me that. You're not going to be blasted on Twitter. It's about having a dialogue, because you could see things in very different lights from what your colleagues see.
Ethan.
Hi, my name is Ethan, and I'm a sophomore here. I kind of had a question on that, like kind of a similar vein, like to what you were just discussing about kind of just talking about after you've put out these stories, and kind of providing a forum or a way for members who are, even if information is correct, they just don't like it. Like how much kind of room do you give them, and how do you kind of stand by your reporting while acknowledging their concerns? I mean, as a student journalist, I've kind of had saying, hey, like, I understand where you're coming from, but we're not going to change it.
There's certain levels that it depends, like how sensitive a story it is and how many sources you have. Sometimes you have one person on background, but you have three people telling you you're correct off the record, so you just can't count them as sources and people won't know. And I've seen members of Congress lie, and I try to give a pause to the members who I felt have always been honest with me. But like in relationships and dating, there's a thing called shit testing. And that's something that I actively seek out doing with members of Congress, which is I sometimes know the answer of what they did, and I will go ask them a question, and I will see if they are truthful to me, or I will see if they lie. And if they lie, how do they lie? Do they get pink in the face? Like some very religious members who will look down at the ground and can't make eye contact, and then you know you got them. Or do they start having different sort of reactions when they lie? I've had very good sources trying to plant stories with me that would have been pretty false if I had taken them. And so you have to approach different things with a level of skepticism, and have members who will sometimes never leak me anything, but they are sounding boards. And I will go and say, hey, can you talk to me about this new policy? Or, hey, can you talk to me about this leadership election? I'm hearing this. Is this correct? And they can either come back and say, yes, this is genuinely something that we're all excited about, or they'll be like, no, people are really protesting this internally. Don't be fooled by this spin that the party's doing more publicly. It's something that you learn the more that you're on the job. And there was one time a staffer who was very young, a comms director, and I was doing a really hard story on their boss. And their boss is one of those kind of controversial firebrands that as going through, and I said, I'm reporting this. And they said, okay. I'm reporting this. And they go, okay, no comment. I'm reporting this. Okay, no comment. I'm reporting this. And they go, that's not correct. And I went back to my source who had spun something, and I come back to them and say, I'm reporting this. And they go, no comment. And I called him back because that was our first time working together. And I said, hey, I just want to let you know you have a little bit of power here after this, because I know this was not a good story, but I felt like you were very honest with me. And the next time you tell me that something's not true, I will give it pause and I will go look into it, because I do not give that power to some of the leadership offices who have lied to me and have been caught in lies. So I will hit that button of publish without giving it a second thought for those offices that have lost the trust, because it is a two-way sort of relationship in that way.
That's interesting. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Malcolm, sophomore.
Also, I like all the questions are coming from what we call the correspondence row. They don't sit there in the audience of like classrooms, but that's like the seat that everyone's elbowing for. And
I think there are some in the back that I'll get after this one.
When you're on the Hill reporting and you're trying to catch a member leaving a meeting or you're texting them, do you ever find that there's competition between you and your counterparts at the other outlets, right? Like, and what happens when,
100%.
when there's tension between you and people who, you want to be on good terms with, but one person gets to run the story first? How do you manage that competition?
So there's some sources who will only talk to me and some sources who will only talk to some of my competitors. But there's certain members who, when we're trying to get a closed door information, will literally copy and paste the same text to me and another reporter. And in those instances, we're usually tweeting it out. And I'll text that member, be like, excuse me, why are you sending that to them first? I was 5 minutes behind. So there is competition. It's usually lighthearted. The thing that will really, really set a fire and kind of turn me from Schmeagol to Gollum is when you go to someone first and say, hey, I'm reporting this story. And they go, that's cute. And they'll text it to another reporter. And that is where you start being like, okay, if you're going to pull that shit, excuse me. And so those are sort of the things. If it's between me and other reporters, it's fair game. And usually they're friends. And we will sometimes even say, hey, time out. I'm reporting this story because we'll all be talking together. Or certain members will bring up stories that I'm talking to in front of competitors, but friends of mine. So there is a little bit of gentlewoman's agreement at this point with some of the people who have just been on the Hill for a long time.
Okay, we have a question right here. Hannah, there's a question right here. Thanks.
Yeah, there's kind of a trend in the American electorate to going toward, using their news sources as like Instagram and X and TikTok and things like that. Could you comment on how that's going to affect our political system and where's that all going to?
I do think it's going to be important for newsrooms to figure out how to reach voters because the younger voters especially are starting to digest their news in a different way. And I'm not on TikTok. I don't really feel comfortable like relaying information that way, but I do think that is eventually where some of the young reporters who are coming in are going to have to experiment. And there is sort of like the competition of bloggers or sort of online commentators who will comment about things happening on the Hill but have never set foot there. And that's just sort of a reality that we can't be sort of saying, hey, that person doesn't know what they're talking about, because we'd be saying that a lot. But I think it's just something that we have to navigate right now. It's been probably a pretty tough year or two for the news industry. There have been a lot of layoffs, and I do know like a lot of people are sort of scared about what the next moves are. I think broadcast and TV are hurting. That's not how, hey sir, that's not how they're metabolizing it. That's one of the members I used to bug back in the day all the time. He's a survivor. And so I don't have a great answer, but I do agree that that's something that the news industry is going to have to confront.
I have a question back here. And then we'll probably wrap up the formal part of the questioning, and then we'll have folks, if they want to talk to Olivia Beavers just casually, we'll have some time for that as well.
Hi, my name is Kyle. I'm a sophomore here. I guess this is sort of like an ethics question.
Yeah.
I know you mentioned toward the end of the questionnaire that you can find a way to put your views aside while pursuing a specific place of work. But I guess I want to ask, how do you choose or balance wanting to activate a specific base or sort of, advocate on behalf of a certain group while also reporting on a specific issue that may not advance that specific stance or may actively work against something you're very passionate about.
Well, can you give me a little more of like an example of what you mean?
Yeah. So for example, like let's say you're for a certain policy or you believe in something that directly impacts you, family members, friends who you're in close conversation with, but then you choose to report on something that may negate that may support a specific issue that may then prompt your audience to feel a specific way that is directly oppositional to what you inherently believe.
Well, I think like if you're covering a policy, you're going to have to cover both sides. If you have family members where it would directly impact them, then you will be able to probably have some good quotes of people who are frontlines on that issue. But you're probably going to be finding a counter opinion, and it's not, from the straight journalism perspective, it's not our jobs to be like pushing a view on people. It's for our readers to read and make the decisions themselves. And if you are writing it in a good way and writing it clearly, maybe people will side with the view that impacts your family. But, you know, sometimes they only read the headlines at this point. So did that answer your question? Okay.
So I'm going to end with this question. You're probably going to say no comment.
No comment.
Who should we be watching for? Because the House is so divided. It's like one of the few, so like nobody really does know who's going to win the control of the House, right? Based on like New York and California and some other seats. So if you were to point out, you know, 3 people, you don't have to identify them by name, but in the House, you've already mentioned Steve Scalise and Jim Jordan, sort of who maybe women Republicans, or who would you say, look, that person seems to be really media savvy, that person seems to be social media savvy on the Republican side, and you see them as emerging as a potential star in the House or a leader of some kind. And then on the Democratic side, you know, do you think there's an emerging power struggle? If it's trifecta for the Republicans, do you think things changed all on the Democratic side?
I think if, you know, Republicans are in power in the House, you're going to have Jeffries staying on as minority leader. And what we have not seen there is Jeffries being able to lead the conference. Pelosi had such a powerful footprint for so long that I think that that's sort of what everyone plans to cover. She also operated in a way that the Republican Party can't operate, which was she was much more fierce about keeping her caucus in line. And Republican leadership post John Boehner felt that they probably could not do anything besides using a carrot. And so if you kind of go back to, was it the Machiavellian, is it better to be loved or feared? Democrats were a little bit more in the fear camp, and Republicans have been more in the popularity survive camp in this. In terms of rising stars, let's see, I think there's Erin Houchin, who's a conservative woman that is well-liked in the Republican conference, and I think that she's going to be someone who's rising. There's sort of a different sort of dual track of where to rise. Some plan very early on into getting into being seniors on committee, and others plan on rising in leadership. So if you look sort of like the young leadership people, there's Lisa McClain, who is now holding the same spot that Mike Johnson had. And I think that spot was largely uncontested until Mike Johnson moved from number 7 to speaker. And so now everyone wanted it, hoping that that opportunity might present itself for them too. There's Blake Moore, who is this very affable, very tall member from Utah, and Randy Feenstra from Iowa, who's very seen as a very sort of studious policy guy. So those are some of the younger people that are not, you know, out there throwing bombs and making large kind of national names for themselves, but are probably doing the things that are right, sort of navigating internally.
That's great. All right. Well, thank you so much for this perspective, and thank you for your time.